So we turn now to the very vexed question of where language came from. It seems to be uh, fundamental to what we consider to be the human species, and no other animal species has anything comparable. They have riotously varied forms of communication and coordination and interaction, but we have not found something that we can recognize as language, and attempts to teach human language to higher apes, to bonobos, chimpanzees, and gorillas have all failed. They've made some progress, but they never really got anywhere near human capacity. So the question arises, what happened over the last 5 or 6 million years? How did language arrive? Should we understand it as having been part of the process of evolution by natural selection in a Darwinian account? And if so, what were the pressures that gave rise to it? When did it happen? And the problem with this question is that language use itself leaves no material traces. So there's no language fossils. It's not clear what the data are that we might refer to in order to construct a scientific account. In 1866, the French Academy of Science went so far as to ban scientists from theorizing about the evolution of language. This is a sort of a radical step the French are prone to take in order to ensure that their intellectual and cultural world is unsullied. It never works. You can't stop people thinking about things. But the reason they did this is that science must distinguish between the plausible stories and the implausible stories. Science doesn't give us pristine truth, but it does give us workable stories that we can rely on. We need to reach consensus, and that is done through joint consideration of empirical evidence. And there doesn't seem to be any obvious empirical evidence that will allow us to recover the story of where language came from. And in the absence of any empirical evidence, there was no principled way to sort out the good stories from the bad, the fanciful hypotheses from the plausible hypotheses, the crazy theories from the good theories. As I said, that didn't work. People still theorized about the evolution of language, and a lot of work has been done on this topic since. But we have more tools at our disposal than they had in France in 1866. So maybe we can do more than nothing. So one kind of question that you can ask is the question of pre-adaptation. In a Darwinian framework, an evolutionary framework, we often find that structures that have evolved for one or in one context get co-opted and serve new functions in another one. Think of the role of feathers, for example, which appeared first probably for temperature control on reptiles. Later on, they became the means for flight, but presumably with a long transitional period. Now, when we ask about pre-adaptation for language, we have to ask, well, which parts of the body are involved in language? Ultimately, the whole body is involved in language. I'm using my whole body to speak right now, but my big toe is probably playing less of a role than my lips, for example. But there's no part of the body that is obviously there for language. There's no part of the body that we can point to. For birds, we point to the feathers and we say, well, they may have originated in a very different context, but now for birds today, they serve the function of flight. And there's no part of the body that we can say that serves the function of language. No part of the brain, no part of the respiratory tract of the mouth. All the parts of the body that are used in speaking and listening, in understanding language and reading and writing, all those parts of the body are there they serve many purposes. We can trace the structures and see how they contribute to language, and look with a very sensitive eye, of course, to differences between us and other animals. Another approach we have that was certainly not available in 1866 is that we can run computer simulations in which, for example, we model the interaction of a bunch of agents exchanging messages under certain constraints, and we can build in processes of change, random change. We can model evolutionary processes and look to see, can we evolve structures from simple to more complex, and do these have characteristics that resemble language? That's an exciting area of research. But perhaps the most obvious place to look, again, not something they could have done in 1866, is to ask about genes. Now, we don't have time here in this course to even give a brief outline of the current state of genetics. But there has been a long history in the 20th century of what we might call genetic determinism, which has identified the gene with the essence of an individual in some bizarre sense. And that story has changed. Genetics has undergone some very fundamental changes in the last 20 years. Go back to the 1970s, 1980s, and it would have been completely unexceptional to have the view that genes, which are sequences of specific molecules in the DNA found in every cell, and passed on in reproduction, that sequence of genes somehow stored a plan for the future phenotype, the developed form of the body. That is no longer a widely held belief. That doesn't make sense anymore. We've learned an awful lot in the meantime. We've learned that genes, while they're very, very important, they do not play that role. And they mean nothing in the absence of an environmental context. Also, when we look at the genes of chimpanzees and bonobos and compare them to human genes, they're almost the same. There are very, very little differences between us and the apes. We lost a lot of hair. That's one difference. And we'll come to one other very important difference in a minute. But genetic variation seems to be unlikely to provide a story here. So the short answer is no, there's not a simple genetic story to be told here. Our understanding of genes has changed. But there's a longer story to be told here, which has an interesting lesson in the sociology of science and the eagerness that we display sometimes for simple answers. So there was one avenue that was explored in the 1970s and 80s, and we can learn a lot from it. It concerns a family known in the literature as the KE family, which was identified in England. And over 3 generations, many but not all members of this family exhibited a rather rare disorder known as developmental verbal dyspraxia. That refers to a kind of a clumsiness in speech articulation that emerges very early. And this was understood to be a language problem. Now, the developmental verbal dyspraxia and the condition exhibited by these members of this family turned out to be an awful lot more complex than was initially assumed. But the pattern of inheritance of this complex disorder was straightforwardly interpretable in terms of genes. Mendelian genetics gives you a means of identifying a disorder that is tied to a specific genetic anomaly, and we have the means to even identify that gene. Genes have funny names. The name of this gene is FOXP2. So let's have a look at FOXP2 and see why it briefly became important here. FOXP2 is found in all mammals, so it's certainly not a purely human gene, and it varies slightly from species to species, as is the case with pretty much all genes. But it's found in all mammals, so it's highly conserved. There are very slight differences in FOXP2 between chimpanzees and humans, and the disorder in the KE family was positively identified as being caused by a mutation on the FOXP2 gene. This set the world of linguistics, biolinguistics, alight. And it was widely reported that the gene for language had been found, and that would have filled in an enormous gap in our knowledge and given us some understanding of why humans are different from apes, and would have completely radically changed our understanding of ourselves. And it was reported as if it had done that. It had done no such thing, though, and the reports were premature. Researchers looking for a gene for language jumped on this and brushed over an awful lot of details. So some of the details are that this is not a pure language deficit. It's a generalized cognitive deficit, which is associated with a late onset of speech, problems in articulation, various other cognitive deficits, and yet those afflicted go on to develop language. And I'm going to show you an example of this in a minute. We understand a bit more about FOXP2 now, and we know that it plays a regulatory role in the healthy development of brains and lungs, co-development of brains and lungs. Now, if you think about speaking and language, that makes a lot of sense. If you have something that alters the way in which brains and lungs co-develop, that it should have manifestations which include our ability to speak, that's not terrifically surprising. But the claim that it was the language gene has been thoroughly debunked now, and it's a valuable lesson to learn that when we have hard questions, we should be very cautious about simple answers. There is no language gene, and we no longer believe we will find a language gene. But I'd like to introduce you to a member of the KE family. I came across a video on YouTube where a young man identified himself as a member of this family. And I'll leave it to you to judge whether this remarkable individual has or has not got the faculty of language.
Hello people, today I'm going to talk about 5 things about me. 5 things about me. Let me think. Number 1, I have a rare speech disorder called FOXP2. If you want to know more information about that, you can. Go to Google on the KE family. I'm famous in the medical history on that. Number 2, I have a learning disability, but I can learn how to sort good things out from that. Number 3, when I was born, I learned sign language. Patrick Gorman, then I changed to Macinton, then I changed to British Sign Language. And from that, when I was young, I was non-verbal, so now I have achieved a lot in that. Number 4, I love helping people in different ways, especially hearing or deaf in the deaf community. I've got a good passion and love about that. But the way it helps me go through what is life. Number 5, I love the internet. I love to talk to people if I can and help people through if they've got any problems like me. That's all I can say from today. I hope you learn anything new. I'll be looking forward to hearing from anyone out there who have the same problem like me, or you want to get to know me. Because I'm at this present moment, I'm very, very lonely. I've got no friends. and stuff like that. So, be looking forward to hearing from you. So, please take care, have a lovely day, and speak to you soon. Take care now. Bye.
Now, I think you'll agree this young gentleman is, first of all, gorgeous character, and he definitely has language. You can still see evidence of the syndrome, the developmental verbal dyspraxia associated with cognitive deficits in learning, late speech onset. And as he says himself, he's pulled wonderful things out of that. He learned sign language because he was averbal, and he likes helping people. So you can clearly see this is not someone with a well demarcated language deficit. So the FOXP2 story we can get rid of. There's no simple genetic story to be told about the origin of language. I'd like to point you to a lesser known hypothesis, which may help us to fill in one small piece of the story. And it comes from the lab of Michael Tomasello, who is a primatologist. He studies chimpanzees, among others. And he has pointed out one small biological change, an evolutionary change that did occur in that time, which is relatively small in terms of biological structures, but possibly far-reaching in terms of its implications for how humans coordinate. Traditional views of language had suggested that syntax was at the heart of language. We have good reason to suspect that there are problems with that view, but if we take a broader view of language and look at language as a means by which humans become coordinated and engage in cooperative activities, then this one change that Tomasello points out acquires a new significance. And the change is this: human eyes have a white surface called a sclera. Apes don't. So this is known as the cooperative eye hypothesis. That change from having a dark background to your pupil to a light background is a small biological change, but look what it does. When you look at a human eye, you know exactly where the person is looking, and you know that you are sensitive to where other people are looking. This means that human children, from a very, very early age, are swathed in folds of joint attention. That is, they very quickly, in all their human interactions, are paying attention to the things that other people are paying attention to. And when we jointly pay attention to something, then we have a shared frame on the world, and we will interpret the world in similar fashions, and we become aligned. We become, as it were, entangled. And this seems like a very important part of the story by which we come to inhabit a shared world, which seems to be a gift of language. Now, human infants developed the capacity to follow gaze very, very early on. At about 9 to 12 months, they can check to see what the caregiver is looking at. They can follow the caregiver's gaze shortly later, but before they're a year and a half old, children can, and like students of Machiavelli, they can direct their caregivers and tell them where to look. So we get this fusing of our attentional focus that seems to change the way in which we live in the same world. So this is certainly not the whole story, but it looks like a very important part of the story. And just for comparison, that's a human eye on the left, and that's an ape in the middle. You can see the eyes are dark. The ape on the right is from Planet of the Apes. He's not a real ape. But look how shifty he looks and crafty. And look at the color of his eyeballs. Right? Now, apes do pay attention to where their conspecifics are looking, but they don't have the clear signal given by a white eyeball with a dark center, which informs very directly where you're looking. So apes follow head direction, but not gaze direction. Now, I suggested to you that there were reasons to doubt that syntax, as it has been identified in the tradition of generative linguistics is all that important when we come to understand the evolutionary story. It's definitely important for understanding how we communicate today. But I want to give you a little bit of a temporal scale on these things. I want to do that by showing you two timelines. Let's look at this one first. Writing changed humans enormously. Writing gives us the capacity to identify language for the first time, to pick out those elements that stand in structural opposition and can be captured by characters, leaving behind those other elements like the musical properties of the voice and the body gestures and the facial expressions that are also always there when we speak. But with writing, we get this partitioning so that we can pick out, as it were, language. And writing doesn't occur until humans live in highly complex, organized societies. Writing occurred 3 times in human history independently. The oldest of those was in ancient Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, and that arose about 5,000 years ago. But writing was confined to an elite minority who were in charge of accounting procedures, trade routes, rituals, advising the king or emperor, rulers, and so on. For most people, writing might as well not have existed. Widespread literacy only became possible with the widespread distribution of texts. And that only happened 500 years ago with the invention of the printing press in Europe. So printing is very, very recent. And so literacy, widespread literacy, is also very recent. And it's only after you have widespread literacy that you can really identify a language, that anyone has any intuitions about whether something is or is not grammatical, that certain forms of the language become, well, throughout the history of writing, certain forms of language become preferred. They become the language of insiders. The powerful, economically powerful, politically powerful will prefer their own dialect, as it were. And so things have been changing since the introduction of writing, and they changed massively 500 years ago with the introduction of printing, and they continue to change today. The humble emoji has entered the scene and is transforming language use. Emojis are very, very important, but if you wanted to understand writing and its effect on our species over the last 5,000 years, you wouldn't start with emojis, would you? So now we want to look at another time scale, and this one is 10 times the size of the last one. I've conservatively estimated human cultural arising at 50,000 years ago, but that's a most conservative estimate. Culture, as we might recognize it, seems to be probably much older than that. But if we take the most conservative estimate, you can see that writing only arose very, very recently, and printing only in the blink of an eye. And it's only with widespread literacy that we can identify language at all. So just as studying the effect of writing on human society and cognition wouldn't start with emojis, so the conventions of highly normative, systematic forms of language use elaborated in complex societies seems like the wrong place to start if we're trying to understand where we came from. And there's one other thing to look at here. I've just given you a timescale that shows that widespread literacy is really, really, really recent. There's something else that's really recent. This here shows the world population over the last 12,000 years, more or less. Look at that spike. Look how recent the vast population of the world, currently approaching 8 billion, is. For almost the entire time that we're talking about in which human culture developed, the world was vastly less populated. People lived relatively isolated in small social groups without major conurbations, major cities, and so on. So we have to remember not only the timescales, but also the population of the world. So the time span in which human culture evolved is very long. Writing played a negligible role in that time. Human social order was completely different. And it seems that Tomasello's suggestion that we look at simple changes that allow us to coordinate differently will tell us more about how we came to the present situation. And so here, we're not talking anymore about language, but the term languaging, make a verb of it, and we will use that term to describe all kinds of coordinative and affiliative activities. That seems to be a more useful way to think about where human language come from and stop looking for a magic bullet of a gene.